Hello, and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear AI researchers chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll provide summaries and discussion of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we didn't cover in this episode. And before we start, if you have any feedback or thoughts about our podcast, feel free to email us at contact@lastweekin.ai. We would love to hear from you. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Sharon Zhou.
And I'm your other host, Andrei Kurenkov. And in this episode, we'll be chatting about two companies that had failed AI products, IBM Watson and Zillow. Talk about some research on code generating from DeepMind and a new GPT-NeoX from AI. We'll talk about an AI insurance company that collected facial recognition data and now faces a lawsuit, and how there's a law in the works to prevent that sort of stuff. And lastly, we'll wind up with some fun applications to generate things with AI.
And so first off, in our applications and business section is an article titled Machine Learning the Hard Way, IBM Watson's Fatal Misdiagnosis. So IBM's flagship AI, Watson Health, based on, IBM Watson doing the health stuff, has actually been sold to venture capitalists for amount around $1 billion, which sounds like a lot, but that's actually only a quarter of what the whole division has cost IBM in acquisitions and such since 2015. And so this was a pretty expensive mess up by IBM's part. It held, a lot of promise. There was a lot of marketing that went into this Watson Health AI. And unfortunately, it's kind of been, shut down now. But just to give some background, so it's been going on for quite some time. The article goes through the whole timeline of Watson Health, how it started, how it, had all these partnerships that it announced, 50 partnerships with healthcare organizations, including Mayo Clinic, which is one of the largest organizations for cancer, lots of hospitals, but unfortunately, none of them actually produced usable tools or apps. And then IBM tried to buy a lot of companies that had successful AI products. But sadly, the article notes that even with all these acquisitions, these companies still died. These healthcare startups that were successful pre-acquisition ultimately died because the system was so led by marketing as opposed to actual work and inputs. Sadly, a lot of the people who were acquired into it did leave, and now it has died. Thoughts on this, Andre?
Yeah, this is a pretty important story to know, I guess, for people who follow AI. I think the failure of Watson is a sort of great example of how AI can't magically solve problems and be useful everywhere. It takes smart use of AI to actually tackle some of these problems, especially in medicine. There is another article from the New York Times, Whatever Happened to IBM's Watson, that also goes into this. And yeah, my impression has always been that IBM sort of tried to couple together a bunch of technologies and call it Watson, similarly for this Watson Health. And yeah, it was just not... The company itself is very bureaucratic, very old school, and wasn't able to actually successfully create this new product. And yeah, I found it pretty sad that they bought up all these companies that ultimately died as a result.
That's always really sad to see because I think the people who started those companies really cared and were hoping that once acquired, it would probably become something even bigger, get greater distribution. So
Yeah, I mean, on the positive side, the space itself is very much alive. A lot of startups are working on AI for medicine and health. So I think there are success stories already, and we'll keep seeing them. But this is a good lesson in sort of being wary of marketing, especially from these giant companies like IBM. And on a related note of companies with failed AI products, we have our next article, How Homeowners Defeated Zillow's AI, which led to Zillow Offers' demise. So this is all about how Zillow had this product, Zillow Offers, where they were basically doing home buying. They were trying to buy homes from homeowners and then sell it themselves, right? And the approach was to try and predict what houses will cost in the future, 3 to 6 months out after buying them, and therefore make a profit. And it was basically a catastrophic failure. They lost a bunch of money, and then they had to close it all down, and they actually had to fire 25% of their staff. So it was a really big deal. And this article kind of analyzes why that happened. And the short version is that the predictions were not very accurate. They often overestimated the cost because the inputs to the model were incomplete, right? So you have a metadata like number of bedrooms, location, but it didn't actually see the house, and the homeowners could make a better prediction and reject low offers and only accept high offers. So that's one. And also, housing prices just stopped rising when they tried to scale this up. So they tried it for a few years and had positive results because of the environment, but then in a different climate, was totally failed. So pretty interesting analysis, I would say. I found it cool to know why this was a result.
I think we've heard a lot, at least, in the Twitterverse. There was a lot of talk at some point when Zillow was buying, when it was revealed that Zillow was buying all these homes and upping all the prices, and people getting kind of upset that Zillow was doing that, and that Zillow kind of deserved this. I think this is a case of an algorithm going, a bit haywire, where they probably wanted something in between, where it didn't actually cause it didn't create a housing bubble or a fake housing bubble in this case, and actually was able to make good judgments. But obviously that didn't happen, and it was a bit late for them to shut it down. It seemed to already cause some damage.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, this analysis, basically, because it seemed like it worked for a few years. They actually did trial it for a while, but that was working primarily because housing, the market was in itself kind of hot. So even when it was inaccurate, they still made a profit. But then, then in 2020, when they tried to scale this up, this was no longer true. So when they overestimated housing costs, that led to very obvious losses. So again, I think a good case study in the pitfalls of using AI without sort of being able to integrate it into a product in a smart way.
Right. And onto our research and advancement section. The first article is titled, DeepMind claims its new code generating system is competitive with human programmers. And so DeepMind, very similar to OpenAI, has created a codex competitor, which is OpenAI's system that is trained on GPT-3 to output code and generate code. And it is called, very surprisingly, Alphacode. Just kidding. It's not surprising. They name all of their systems Alpha something, like Alpha Zero, AlphaGo. And Alphacode basically has been able to show that it can write competition level code, quote unquote, and achieve an average ranking within the top 54% across 10 recent contests. with more than about 5,000 participants in it. And so this is impressive in the sense that now, beyond Codex, it can generate competitive code, a good code that maybe is now of higher, a much higher bar than I think when Codex came out. It was, we can generate reasonable code, but it still seems average. And here it's like we can generate competitive code. The actual architecture and stuff involved is not super interesting. It is just basically a larger version of 4x the size of Codex at 41.4 billion parameters. And it is trained on a data set that is roughly the same size as Codex is at around 700 gigabytes of data. And so, it's again trained on public repos on GitHub in different programming languages. And I think all in all, it is interesting that all these companies are going in this direction. It's not super surprising since it is a very lucrative market. And even turning code from one language to another is very lucrative, let alone writing very good code is very, very lucrative, and also is a sweet spot for these tech companies that have a lot of software engineers, and you can see where this would go. And again, Facebook and Intel also have models in this space as well.
Yeah, I think we were chatting and this seemed a bit underwhelming in the sense that it's basically the same idea as Codex, train a language generating model on a bunch of code and it kind of works. If anything, this seemed less exciting than Codex because this task of writing competition level code, of solving programming problems is much less useful than what Codex does. Codex is sort of meant to be used by programmers as an auto-completion tool to speed up your productivity. And it can do a lot of writing of boilerplate, really simple stuff that isn't hard. Alphacode does something harder, which is to generate entire algorithms given the description of it. So from an AI perspective, this is harder because it needs to be syntactically correct. It needs to take into account sort of reasoning and on all these different things, but it's much less useful. It's neat that you can do this competition level programming, but in the real world, that's not something that programmers really need help with. And although it sounds like it's pretty impressive, I really wonder at how this is, performing. It's in the top 54.3% in 10 recent contests, but how well does the average human competitor do? It's kind of hard to tell from what they've released.
Right. It's really hard to tell, but I think they did try to, pick competitions that were, had a lot of participation, and they did, they did do it live. So I think it's a step in the right direction. Obviously, the results or the insight is that bigger is better again, maybe. So it's not horribly interesting, but it is the trend.
That's true. And yeah, we've chatted also about DeepMind having all these applied efforts, like we have done weather forecasting and of course, protein prediction. So in that sense, it's neat to see them doing more of these high engineering effort things that apply AI to kind of solving useful problems. And on to our next story, also related to big models. We are going to talk about Alphacode AI announcing GPT-NeoX. So Alphacode AI is kind of a neat group. I think we've chatted about them once or twice in the past. They are a grassroots collective that does open source AI research. So it's interesting. They started off as this like band of hackers that got on a Discord and wanted to replicate GPT-3 back in 2020. And they've been on this quest to replicate GPT-3, which is hard because it's gigantic. It's 175 billion, which for most AI developers is out of reach. It's really only something that giant corporations can do. But now they've announced their latest result, GPT-NeoX, which is a 20 billion parameter model, basically similar to GPT-3. So in the past, they've had GPT-J, GPT-Neo, which were 3 and 6 billion. And so this is the biggest one yet. And not, I guess, too surprising, or there's nothing sort of research interesting here, but they do note this is the largest publicly accessible pre-trained language model. And I think a lot of people will build on this as they have on GPT-J and GPT-Neo. So it's exciting to see them continuing to make progress, in particular because they are open source.
I think this is a great thing that they keep building larger and larger models, but of course they're always going to be a little bit behind. But yeah, I'm excited to try this new one out. I've been playing with GPT-Neo and GPT-J quite a bit.
Yeah, and it's truly open source. They're releasing it under the pretty permissive Apache 2.0 license, so definitely something that a lot of people will benefit from.
And on to our next section on society and ethics. Our first article is titled AI Insurance Company Faces Class Action for Use of Biometric Data. So Lemonade, which is an AI insurance company based in New York, actually is facing a class action lawsuit for violating some laws around using biometric data without consent. And this is specifically using facial recognition to analyze videos that people were submitting in the claims process for insurance. And I actually think Lemonade really created their own demise here on Twitter, which is pretty classic, a classic use of Twitter, I believe. So they now they tweeted around, something touting all the data points they use on their customers, how it's 100x more data than traditional insurance, and how they're using this really great, quote, charming artificial intelligence bot that picks up on, quote, nonverbal cues that traditional insurers cannot, and that this ultimately helps them lower their loss ratios and overall operating costs. And this was all tweeted and now deleted, but I think people got really sus that there was something going on with those nonverbal cues that people were analyzing in their videos, that Lemonade was analyzing their videos. And so a class action was actually filed against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of this class action was talking about this non-consensual collection and analysis of data, which actually apparently went against their privacy policy, and also it goes against New York's Uniform Deceptive Trade Practices Act. So there's some very reasonable legal backing to this lawsuit. And certainly I think this is, pretty clearly bad practice on the part of this company. Even if it was justifiable to do this facial analysis, they should have disclosed it and, should have kind of made a clear case for it. Instead, they tweeted this thing that elicited all this criticism. So it's kind of a funny story, but I guess it's good that, ultimately people were concerned and were able to do something. And on a related note to that, actually, we have our next story. Democratic lawmakers take another stab at AI bias legislation. So Democrats in Congress, Senator Ron Wyden and Cory Booker, along with House Representative Yvette Clarke, introduced an updated version of the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which I think we chatted about a couple of years back, that would require audits of AI systems used in things like finance, healthcare, housing, education, and more. So yeah, it's interesting. It basically says that companies that make use of AI tools in critical decision making to evaluate outcomes for things like finance, like giving loans or, predicting medical treatments, they would have to perform an audit and report their findings to the FTC. And the FTC would force the companies to make these high-profile AI decisions public, or how they do decision-making public. So yeah, it's pretty related to this Lemonade story in the sense that if this were to pass, Lemonade would have to actually submit this to the FTC and would then be scrutinized. What do you think about this act, Sharon?
I think it makes sense that lawmakers are thinking about this, and this feels like regulation in the direction of where all the buzz has been. So it makes sense to now require audits. I'd be curious what they really mean by audits and what is considered a valid audit. There are a lot of tools out there, startups out there that are claiming that they do these audits. I don't know to what extent they would follow this act. They probably will try very hard to. And so I'm curious to see where that goes and whether this becomes more of a compliance thing or whether this is actually quite critical in the path towards safe AI.
Yeah. Just looking at the introduction, the summary here, it's saying that assessments of high-risk automated decision system must describe the system in detail, assess the relative costs and benefits of it, determine the risks to privacy and security, to personal information, and explain the steps taken to minimize those risks if discovered. And of course, in the act, there's presumably much more. So it seems like on a high level view, this is the right thing to do. This is just another aspect of consumer protection to be taken. Obviously, there may be kind of details that you're not aware of, but hopefully this one has some chance. It didn't succeed in the past, but maybe with this revision, it could see being passed.
Potentially. And so on a much lighter note, in our fun and neat section is an article titled AI Generated Valentine's Cards. And this is from AI Weirdness. And of course, okay, so Valentine's Day is coming up. And the thought from this AI Weirdness blog is, what if the messages that you got on your Valentine's cards could be not generic, but instead weirdly unsettling? That is, what if the cards were generated by a glitchy AI? So this is a really interesting kind of approach. They used, kind of a GPT model to output the message as well as what the card, the drawing, the illustration should be on the card. And just for some fun examples, one of my favorite ones is "with all my sparkle pants," and it is a picture of a unicorn, I believe. And another one is "Happy Valentine. That's what my friends call it." And there's a picture of a chicken. It's just very strange, very, very strange. There's one, "Valentine, how cuddly." And I believe it's a picture of a donut wearing a crown. So it's just like really weird things. And it was trained on some real cards that were given to GPT-3 including and the real cards, honestly, they're kind of weird as they're chosen to be weird ones as well. And they're ones of, I think, punny animal things. So for example, Valentine fun, no problema for someone like you. And there was an image of a llama. So that was a real one. Another real one was Valentine, you're clawfully nice. Image of a lobster, like these are real ones that were used to train it. So hence why, strange things kind of came out of the model. And I think what was really funny was the blogger, tried all the different sizes of GPT-3 models from Da Vinci to Ada and also Babbage in between. And ultimately concluded that there wasn't a huge difference in performance because all of them seemed really weird.
Yeah, this is quite amusing. AI Weirdness is this blog that does this on a weekly basis, does weird experiments, and is always a lot of fun. Some of my favorites were hugs for your Valentine from the inside. And there's some images of lips. There is happy day of the year. It has like a kitten face. These are all pretty good, and as per the title of this website, it is pretty weird and amusing. So, I think I always am a fan of AI for humor, for the sort of surreal, weird stuff, and this is a pretty good example of that. And on to our next fun application of AI, a little bit similar, but now for text. This article about it is titled, Tell This AI Your Story's Themes, and it'll write the first paragraph for you. So this is about this thing called narrative device. It was created by Rodolfo Ocampo, who is a PhD student on human AI creative collaboration. And it's this little website where you can enter 2 words like a space marine and demons, and then it generates a paragraph to sort of kickstart the story. So given a space marine and demons, it says the space marine looked around the dimly lit room, his eyes scanning the grotesque creatures that littered the floor. They were demons, and he had been sent to deal with them. He had been trained for this, and he was ready, and so on. Another one that I found quite amusing, there was a sad dad and revenge, playing off of a famous video game, and given those to it said the sad dad was sitting in his room thinking about how revenge would be the best way to make his daughter happy. So not very useful, but it's pretty fun to mess around with a little bit, and it just as a quick hack, I think is certainly kind of fun.
That kind of summarized a lot of GPT use cases. Not very useful, but kind of fun.
Yeah, and that's also nice,
That is also nice. I mean, AI Dungeon has gotten pretty far with just that mantra.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's fun to just see some experiments, right? This particular idea of 2 words and it generates a paragraph for you. Not so useful, but I could see if it wrote a story outline for you, given a few themes and characters, that would be very useful. So close to something I would want to use, let's say.
What else is missing? What's missing for you?
I think this whole paragraph, I don't know that the intro paragraph is something you need. I think you would need sort of a story summary or outline. That's much more useful.
Right. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. So before we go, please let us know again your thoughts. You have any thoughts directly to our email at contact@lastweekin.ai. And thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. And as always, we'll finish with a little request
to review the podcast and share it with your friends and so on. I actually checked today, and we now have 12 reviews on Apple Podcasts.
Greatly appreciated, folks. Greatly appreciated. I mean, I just feel like so touched. I feel like it's one of those Valentine's cards, really just, it's like one of those that touched me.
That was exciting.
It was super macro textacularly big thanks for you.
Exactly.
That's actually one of them.
Yes. So, thank you for those who have reviewed it. And we'd appreciate it if you are a fan of a podcast, if you could stop by. I think we link to Apple Podcasts in the description, or you can Google it. Just give us a quick 5 stars. Even a 4 stars would do. But, you don't have to, but it would be cool if you do. And with that, we are done. Be sure to tune in to us next week.
Woo!